All right, I'm going to go over the worksheet that I sent out yesterday where you had to write the functions. So looking at number 1, it says that you're doing a sine function that starts going up. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw a sine function that goes up, has an amplitude of 5, has a period of 3 pi, has been shifted to the left 4 pi over 3, and has been shifted up to the midline 3 units. So this one's pretty straightforward. The amplitude is 5, so A is 5. You know that the midline is y equals 3, so D is 3. For the period, we have the formula that 2 pi over B equals the period. So I'm going to set 2 pi over B equal to 3 pi. And then I'm going to solve that by multiplying both sides by B. Oops, I should probably actually multiply both sides by B. Let's do it in this step. So that these cancel. I get 2 pi equals 3 pi B. And then I can divide both sides by 3 pi. And I get B equals 2/3. And then for the phase shift, I know that it's 4 pi over 3 is the phase shift. That's equal to C over B. I just calculated that B was 2/3. So I can multiply both sides by 2/3. Those cancel, because that's like 2/3 over 1. And I get C equals 8 pi over 9. And so if I put this all together, I can write y equals 5 sine. It's positive sign because it goes up first. B was 2/3. X, it moved to the left. So that means there's a plus. 8 pi over 9 plus D. And so there's number 1, and I kind of missed my box there. So we'll just kind of go like that. All right, cosine function that starts at its maximum. So cosine starts at its maximum, goes like that. Has an amplitude of 3/2, period of 2 pi over 3, shifted to the right pi, and down 2. Again, down 2. This one's pretty straightforward. This tells me that D is -2. Let's do the period. 2 pi over 3 equals 2 pi over B. You could spend some time here solving that equation, or you could just realize that the only way that works is if B equals 3. And then you have pi, the phase shift, equals C over 3, which means that C is going to equal 3 pi. And so we can start writing. This is a positive cosine, so the amplitude was 3/2. Cosine, B is 3. It moved to the right, so I'm going to subtract 3 pi plus the phase, or the midline, which was -2. You could write -2, but I already put the plus in, so let's see if I do better with my box there. All right, so that's your number 2. Number 3, a sine function that starts going down has an amplitude. Okay, so starts going down looks like this. Okay, so that's going to be a negative sign. Has an amplitude of 12, period of 20, shifted right 6, and shifted up 16. Okay, so one thing I want to point out here is notice that here the amplitude is 12 and A is 12. In fact, A is actually -12 because it starts going down. But the period is 20. B is not 20. Okay, you need to solve for B. We know that 2 pi over B is equal to the period. And then you need to use this to solve for B. So I'm going to multiply both sides by B, divide by 20. And I'm going to reduce that fraction because you have to reduce all your fractions to get B equals pi over 10. Again, the period is 20, b is pi over 10. Similarly, we know that the phase shift went right 6, so c over b is equal to 6. So c over pi over 10 is equal to 6. And so I can multiply both sides by pi over 10 and reduce that fraction and get 3 pi over 5. This tells me d is 16, so now I can put this all together. Y equals negative 12, because it starts going down. It's a sine function. B we solved to be pi over 10. It's moving right, so I'm going to subtract. C is 3 pi over 5 plus 16. All right, number 4, a cosine function that starts at its minimum. Okay, so it's going to look like this. Okay, sorry. Amplitude of 40. But this is a negative cosine, so it's going to be negative 40. A is going to be negative 40, period. Is 30. It is not shifted left or right, but it is shifted up 32. Okay, so 2 pi over b equals the period, multiply both sides by b. 2 pi equals 30b, divide both sides by 30. B equals pi over 15. C is going to be 0 because it's not phase shifted. And D was up 32, so 32. So Y equals negative 40 cosine pi over 15x, no C, plus 32. Okay. Number 5, a cosine function that starts at its maximum. So it's going to look like that. Starts at its maximum and gives us a point here. That's interesting. Goes down to its minimum. Oops, that should be a 4. And then back up to its maximum. So it doesn't seem like they give us a lot of information here. So what we need to find is the amplitude, the period, the phase shift, and the midline. Let's start with the period. The period is the length of the cycle, the distance from the start to the end. And if I go from 2, x coordinate of 2, to an x coordinate of 8, that has a distance of 6. So the period is going to be 6. If we look at the phase shift, my start here was at 2. So it's like I moved right 2. So my phase shift is right 2. And then I need to figure out my amplitude and my midline. Well, my amplitude is the distance from the midline up to its max or down to its min. And it has to be the same. Those numbers have to be the same. So if the whole way from the max to the min is 8, then halfway to the midline is going to be 4. So wherever the midline is, I went up 4 to get to 12, down 4 to get to 4, because that's a total distance of 8. So the amplitude is 4. And then finally, the midline you can get by looking at where I would have to be in order to go down 4 to get to 4 and up 4 to get to 12. And hopefully that's clearly at y equals 8. Okay, so from that, then you can go through the calculations to find what you need to find here. So let's do the period. 2 pi over b equals 6. 2 pi equals 6b. b equals 2 pi over 6, or pi over 3. And then c over b equals 2. C over pi over 3 equals 2. I need to get rid of that fraction, so I'm going to multiply both sides by pi over 3. Those cancel, and I get c equals 2 pi over 3. And then a equals 4, d equals 8. And this is a cosine, positive cosine, so it's y equals 4 cosine pi over 3 x minus, and it's minus because it's to the right, 2 pi over 3 plus 8. And it probably would be helpful if I were numbering these. That was number 5. Okay, so number 6. A sine function that starts on its midline and then goes down. So it looks like that. This is the point -3, -5. Goes down to its minimum at 1, -7. Returns to the midline, goes up to its maximum, and eventually returns to the midline at the point 13, -5. Okay, so this means that our period is this total distance. That would be 16. And then the phase shift. I did it in blue. I drew it in green, so I've gone green. I had to go back 3 to get to the starting point. So my phase shift is left 3. And then my midline, hopefully you can see that the midline would be wherever that first point is, the y-coordinate. So that's at y equals -5. Okay, so that's the midline. And then finally the amplitude would be the distance from the midline down or the midline up. Well, we don't know anything about that point, so we got to do it here. We went from -5 to -7. That means the amplitude is 2. And so then we can do 2 pi over b equals period, which is 16. Save a little time here. I'm going to get pi over 8 is equal to b. C over b equals 3. C over pi over 8 equals 3. C equals 3 pi over 8. If I put this all together, the amplitude was 2, but it's a negative sign. Pi over 8b, oops, pi over 8x, it moved left, so it's a plus. 3 pi over 8 minus 5. Okay. Next one, a sine function that starts at the point -2, 9, goes to its maximum. So we're going positive sine -2, 9, maximum 5, 13. And then continues from there. Oh my, that is not a lot of information. Is it enough? Well, from this we should be able to find the midline, because it starts at its midline. So y equals 9. We should be able to find the phase shift pretty easily. First point starts at -2, so it went left 2. We should be able to find the amplitude, because it went from 9 up to 3 or 13. That's going up 4. So the amplitude is 4. It's a positive sign. The only thing we're missing here is the period. How are we going to find that? Well, the hint here is that whenever you have a trig function and you draw one cycle, you can break this up into 4 equal parts. You can break it up at its middle, and then again at its max and its min. And those 4 parts form the one cycle. So because we know this distance, this x distance, we can actually figure out the period. It went from -2 to 5. That's a distance of 7, which means that this has to be 7, this has to be 7, this has to be 7. Okay, so the period here is going to be 4 times that, or 28. So from there, 2 pi over b equals 28. Solve, b equals pi over 14. C is going to equal pi over 7. So y equals 9 sine pi over 14x. You move left, so that'll be a plus the midline, which was 9. And I put the midline where the amp was supposed to be, so that would be 4. That was number 7. All right, do number 8. Cosine function that starts at its point 9, negative 14, and then starts at the point and then goes to its maximum and continues. So if it's starting at the point 9, negative 14, and then going to its maximum, we know that cosine either starts at its minimum or its maximum, so it must be starting, whoops, I should label that, at its minimum, and goes to its point, goes to its maximum there. So for this one, if this is the period, that's half the period. So if I went from 9 to 25, that's 16. So this has to be 16, so the whole thing has to be 32. So the period is 32. The phase shift is right 9, because that first point is 9. The midline, nope, let's do the amplitude first. The amplitude is going to be whatever this total amount is here, cut in half. So if I went from negative 14 up to 2, that's 16. So the amplitude is 8. And then if I go down 8 from 2, or up 8 from negative 14, that's going to tell me the midline is y equals negative 6. 2 pi over b equals the period. B equals pi over 16. C is going to equal, 9 pi over 16. Okay, again, you have to solve those equations. And don't say that the period is pi over 16. Say the period is 32, but b is that. B and the period are not the same thing. That's a common mistake that people make. All right, this was a negative cosine, so I'm going to start at negative 8 cosine b x. It moved to the right, so it's minus 9 pi over 16 plus negative 6. That was number 8. All right, how many more of these we got? Oh, 4 more. Jeez, how are we doing on time? 18 minutes. All right, I guess I have room here. So 9. Function starts at its maximum of 20 at time 0. So starts at its maximum, time 20. Takes 40 seconds to reach its minimum. It's 6. So this is 0, 20. This is 40, 6. And then we'll continue that. So this is a positive cosine. It has no phase shift. It has a period of, well, let's see what happened here. This is 40 seconds, so this has to be 40 seconds, has a period of 80. Has an amplitude, well, 20 to 6, that's 14. So the period, or the amplitude, sorry, is half that, which is going to be 7. And then finally the midline would be 7 up from 6, which is 13, or 7 down from 20, which is 13. So it's y equals 13. So from that, you can solve for b. 2 pi over b equals 80. B equals pi over 40. And so we get 7 cosine pi over 40x minus, oh, nope, there's no phase shift, plus 13. Okay. Number 10. Function starts its midline at 14. So we tell tells us the midline is 14, and it's starting there. At time 0, it takes 15 seconds to reach its minimum of 5, and then that's it, they'd say. So it's going to go like that. It's a negative sign. This minimum was 15 seconds and a minimum of 5. This was 0, 14. Okay, so if it takes 15 seconds, remember what 15 seconds, it's going to take 15 seconds there, it's going to take 15 seconds there, and there, which means this takes a minute or 60 seconds. So the period, 60, midline, y equals 14, the phase shift is none, the amplitude went from 14 down to 5, that is 9. And so we can write our equation. I gotta solve for b. Not 14, why'd you put that? b equals pi over 30. So we get y equals negative 9 sine pi over 30, there's no phase shift, plus 14. 11. Function starts at its midline at time 0. Takes 30 seconds to complete one cycle. So that right there tells you that the function is starting at its midline, which means it's a sine function, and that its period is 30 seconds. It goes back and forth between the maximum and minimum y coordinates of -4 and 6. So the min is -4, the max is 6. From that, we should be able to tell the amplitude would be half that distance. That distance is 10, so the amplitude is 5. And the midline would be 5 down from 6 or 5 up from -4. That's y equals 1. So the only thing left to figure out is if there's a phase shift. And there isn't, because it says it starts at its midline. The only thing it doesn't tell us is, does it go up from its midline or down from its midline? So for this one, you actually could have either answer. So we're going to get one answer like this. Oh, I didn't solve for b. Don't forget your x. I didn't forget it, okay. Plus the midline of 1. You could also have made that negative if you had your starting going down. All right, let's squeeze on the last one here, 12. Function starts at its maximum of 25 at time 3. It reaches its midline of 13. For the second time at time 18. So that's here. Ooh, tricky. And then back up to its max. So this is cosine. So immediately we know midline, y equals 13. We know phase shift is right 3. We know that the amplitude is the distance from 13 up to 25. That is 12. And we need to find the period. All right, so what makes this one tricky is that the period, we know, is cut up into 4 sections. And for this, it says that from 3 to 18, those 15 seconds gets you through those 3 fractions of the cycle, which means that each one is going to be 5. Last one's going to be 5, which means my period here is 20. So 2 pi over b equals 20, b equals pi over 10. C over b equals 3, so c over pi over 10 equals 3. So c equals 3 pi over 10. And finally put that all together. Positive cosine, amplitude is 12. B is pi over 10, x. It moved right, so it's a minus. plus, what's my midline? 13. And just so you can see how this is going to work, what you could do is you should be able to take this point, 18, plug it in for x, and you should be able to get an answer out. So let's just real quick do that so you can see that it works. I know that this is a long video, but I just want you to see that it works. We're plugging in 18 minus 3 pi over 10 plus 13. So y equals 12. Oh, I forgot the cosine. Okay, cosine of, so I'm going to get 18 pi over 10 minus 3 pi over 10 is that. That's going to be 15 pi over 10, which is 3 pi over 2. Over 2 plus 13. Cosine of 3 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2 is 1.5 pi, is that angle down there. Cosine of that point is the x coordinate, which means that this whole thing is going to be 0. So 12 times 0 is 0. This is going to be 13. And if you look here on the point, it was at the y equals 13 midline. So if I plug in 18, I get 13. And that's what I was supposed to get from the graph. And you can actually go back to any of the problems on this page and check your answers that way. All right, that's it.